They didn't lose you in a moment. They lost you in every moment they made you question your worth. You were the calm after their chaos, the love after their lesson. But they weren't ready for peace. They remember you, not just for the love you gave, but for the healing they weren't brave enough to accept. Some people don't miss you. They miss what you gave freely without making them earn it. You stopped explaining yourself, and suddenly they called you distant, but it was the closeness they never appreciated that made you leave. They treated you like a breakable thing until they realized you were the strongest loss they'd ever face. Their absence didn't break you. It revealed how deeply you had carried someone who never once lifted you. They called you replaceable, but even the silence you left behind can't be duplicated. They didn't know how to love you, so they made you feel hard to love. They took your softness for surrender, but you were never meant to be caged. They don't cry for you. They cry for the comfort they lost when your love stopped showing up. You stayed longer than you should have, and now they'll spend a lifetime wondering why they ever let you. They miss the version of you that bent. You became the version that no longer breaks. They saw you as a backup plan. Now they can't find anything worth holding on to. You were too much for their ego and not enough for their wounds, and now they know it was never you. Their heart is haunted by everything they didn't say, while yours is healing from everything they did. You walked away quietly, and somehow that silence roars louder in their dreams than anything you ever screamed. You taught them lessons they weren't wise enough to cherish, and now they replay the test they failed. They thought distance would give them power. Now it only magnifies their regret. You gave your soul, and they gave excuses. Now your peace is the price they're paying. They told stories that made them the victim, but even their shadow knows the truth. They felt safe because you stayed, but safety was never the same thing as love. The love you gave them was a shelter. Now they wander through storms they created alone. They didn't see your tears. They saw your strength and assumed you had none to shed. They used your love like currency, only to find out your heart was never for sale. They keep your name soft in their throat, because saying it too loud might bring back the ache. They didn't walk away. They watched you drown and said you were too deep. You gave them access to your soul. They treated it like a hotel room. You weren't just another heart. They carved your name into their fate. You outgrew the version of them that was never meant to stay. You were the reminder that they couldn't keep what they never appreciated. They didn't lose you by accident. They lost you by choice. You didn't change. You evolved, and they couldn't handle your wings. Their guilt is the ghost of every lie they told while you loved them truthfully. You weren't hard to love. You were hard to fool. You were never broken. You were just surrounded by people who couldn't hold wholeness. They didn't ruin you. They revealed you. You walked in like hope, and they treated you like convenience. They didn't love you wrong. They just didn't love you enough to grow. They never expected you to glow without them. But now your light blinds them. You stopped chasing. They started reminiscing. They replaced you with noise. But nothing silences the echo of your presence. You became sacred the moment you stopped begging. They see you everywhere now, not because you're near, but because you became unforgettable. They were addicted to your kindness and allergic to your boundaries. You were a moment of clarity in a life full of confusion. You were the remedy they weren't ready to take. You were not their punishment. You were their permission to change. You stopped making excuses for their damage, and suddenly they called you cold. They weren't ready for the love they asked for. You were rare. They were reckless. They tried to hurt you into silence, but you healed into power. They called it closure. You called it finally breathing. They still look for you in people who only remind them what they lost. You were not too intense. They were too used to empty. They loved the way you stayed until you didn't. You were the spark in their darkness. Now they chase matches. They lost you slowly like erosion. Now your absence is carved into their soul. They took your patience for passivity until you stopped waiting. You were not a chapter. You were the whole book they didn't bother to read. You didn't give up. You let go. You weren't impossible. They were unwilling. They used your love like armor. until you left and they had to face themselves unprotected. They mistook your understanding for permission. They buried you with silence, and you bloomed in their absence. You were the clarity they ignored while chasing confusion. You taught them how to love. Now they're trying to teach someone else with broken hands. You were peace. They were noise. They made you feel like too much. You were just too real. You were their pause in a chaotic life. But they pressed play without learning the lesson. They couldn't destroy you, so they dismissed you. You walked away with nothing, and still you became everything. They tried to forget you, but real doesn't fade. You were a masterpiece they only glanced at. They chose easy. You chose real. You were a warning dressed as warmth. They wanted a muse, not a mirror. You were love, and they were only prepared for attention. They underestimated your goodbye. You gave them oceans, they gave you drought. You weren't meant to stay small to make them feel big. They wanted fireworks. You were a sunrise. They didn't lose you in the end. They lost you from the beginning. Every time they ignored the little things. You were a lesson they refused to learn. Now they live in detention with their own thoughts. They saw you as an option, until life showed them you were the answer. They chose silence. You chose peace. You showed them heaven. They chose the hell they were used to. You were gravity. They preferred to float through fantasy. You were loyal. They were temporary. You gave them light. They shut the blinds. You offered depth. They stayed shallow. You gave them a future. They chose nostalgia. You were ready. They were reckless. They kept you on hold. You hung up and healed. They called you home, but never came back. You gave 100%. They gave 100 excuses. You gave more than love. You gave yourself. They gave less than effort. You were love they didn't deserve. Now they beg for it in fragments. You were everything they asked for in a prayer, and everything they rejected in fear. You were the one that got away, but more than that, you were the one that grew too big to stay. You exist in their dreams not because they remember you, but because their soul still hasn't figured out how to forget the parts of themselves they left in your hands. Every night they close their eyes, hoping to find peace, but all they see is the version of you they failed to keep, whispering goodbye in every heartbeat. In their dreams, you're still holding on, because in their reality, they let you slip through fingers that never learned to grasp what mattered. They wanted space. You gave them silence. Now they're learning the difference between being free and being alone. Some goodbyes aren't loud. Some sound like "take care" and feel like bleeding out in someone else's silence. They used to dream of a future with you. Now they dream of apologies they'll never get the chance to say. The version of you in their dreams is still smiling, still forgiving, still soft. But when they wake, all they have is the cold truth that you're not coming back. They didn't lose you all at once. It happened in pieces, like watching their favorite song being erased note by note. What haunts them isn't your absence. It's how peaceful you became without them. You became their lesson, not because you wanted to teach, but because you refused to stay where you were not cherished. They never imagined the day would come when your silence would speak louder than their words. Your energy was healing. Your heart was a mirror, and now that it's gone, they're left staring at their own reflection, finally seeing the cracks. They begged for time and space. Now they drown in the very silence they once demanded. In their dreams, you haven't changed. But in real life, you've grown into someone they no longer deserve to know. Every time they close their eyes, your memory blooms, and every morning, reality withers it again. You were the light they covered with their shadow. Now they live in darkness, searching for the flame they once ignored. You didn't walk away because you stopped caring. You walked away because they kept choosing comfort over commitment. They called you dramatic. Now they're telling your story like a tragedy they were forced to watch. They didn't expect your glow to grow brighter once you left, and now it blinds them every time they scroll through the life you rebuilt. The version of you they miss the most is the one who still believed they could change. When they left, they thought you'd break, but all you did was bloom where they buried you. They used to love how deeply you felt, until your silence made them realize it was never weakness, but warning. You were their sanctuary, but they were tourists in your soul, never intending to stay. Your energy still lingers in their space, not because you want to haunt them, but because they never truly let you go. You gave them love in its purest form, and they gave you lessons in survival. They asked for closure like you owed them something, but some stories end without applause. They remember your kindness, now that they've met cold hearts that only echo, never listen. They let go of the flower and held onto the thorn. Now they bleed alone, calling it fate. They forgot your worth until they saw someone else holding the version of you they took for granted. You became unforgettable not because they loved you, but because you loved them when they didn't deserve it. In their dreams, you still call their name softly, but when they wake, it's the silence that answers back. They thought your love would wait forever, not realizing time doesn't freeze for those who don't show up. You didn't just walk away. You taught them what it means to lose a soul that once called theirs home. They asked you to be patient while they stayed uncertain. Now they're begging for a chance you no longer need to give. You weren't difficult to love. You were difficult to manipulate. They fell in love with the idea of you, not the reality of having to grow beside someone so real. They thought your absence would bring them peace, but it only made the noise in their soul louder. You were the calm in their chaos. Now that you're gone, even their silence feels loud. They didn't realize how much you carried until you stopped carrying them. In their dreams, you're still holding on. In real life, you're already free. Some people confuse your boundaries with betrayal until they meet someone without any. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because they stopped noticing. Your silence is louder than their apologies could ever be. They built walls thinking they were protecting their heart. Now they can't find the key back to yours. They wanted love without effort, loyalty without sacrifice, and healing without accountability. In their dreams, you're still reaching for them, but in your reality, your hands are now holding peace. You gave them the best of you, and they gave you just enough to keep you doubting your worth. They ignored the love in your eyes. Now they search the world for a gaze that feels half as safe. They remember every version of you except the one who finally gave up. You weren't a phase. You were a mirror, and they shattered you to avoid seeing themselves. They keep reliving the day you left, not because you hurt them, but because they didn't stop you. They didn't lose you because of who you are. They lost you because of who they refused to become. You stayed through storms they created, and when the skies cleared, they acted like you were never there. They used to run to you when life got hard. Now, all they can do is scroll past memories and wonder if you still care. They promised forever, but gave up before they even unpacked their fear. You weren't hard to love. They just weren't ready to receive something real. They didn't just miss out on your love. They missed the future they were too afraid to commit to. Their biggest regret isn't losing you. It's realizing you never needed them to be whole. They didn't break your heart. They broke their own chance at something rare. You were the blessing they mistook for convenience. You were the anchor in their storm, but they cut the rope thinking they could float alone. They saw your softness as weakness until the day you chose to walk away with your head held high. They thought your silence was surrender. It was actually your victory lap. In their dreams, you forgive them. But in reality, you've already healed and moved on. They wanted your light, but weren't willing to match your flame. You weren't too much. They were simply too empty to hold all of you. They romanticized chaos and resented your peace. Now, they miss the stability they never learned to appreciate. They remember your voice not for what you said, but for the comfort it carried even in conflict. You didn't just walk away. You reclaimed the parts of you they didn't bother to understand. Their love had limits. Yours had scars. And you finally realized that real love doesn't come with conditions. You offered them depth. They drowned in their own shallowness. They didn't lose a person. They lost a purpose they weren't ready to grow into. They prayed for love, and the universe gave them you. But they weren't ready for the truth that came with it. They still wear your energy like perfume, lingering in spaces you no longer enter. They were comfortable in the chaos. You wanted peace. That's where the roads split. They thought love was ownership. You showed them it was freedom. You didn't ask them to be perfect. You just asked them to show up, and they failed to do even that.